Round 1, fight!
Welcome to part 4 of my exploration of all of the weird versions of the Street Fighter games. In today's video, I'll be diving headfirst into the Commodore 64 version, which has to be seen to be believed and has to be played to be fully appreciated. To set the scene, on the C64 version of Street Fighter 2, I think it's only fair to read the on-screen disclaimer that the game gives you when you boot it up. It warned you that, due to limitations and spec of this machine, some of the implementations contained in the manual may be incorrect. Now, weirdly, the text seems to have a full stop after the word spec and no comma after machine. But heck, this isn't punctuation fighter. This is a fighter where you be punctuating Bison in the face. Ta-da, that's my joke. But seriously, this warning should be noted, as the C64 has very limited specs compared to the arcade machine that this game originally appeared on. But also, let's take one more moment just to look at what it said there. It says, due to the limitation and spec of this machine, I get that, some of the implementations contained in the manual may be incorrect. What does it mean by implementations? I think what it is actually getting at is just some of the content it speaks about in the manual just isn't in this version because the manual was just the manual written for every version, like the Amiga, the DOS version, anything else that I guess US Gold, who may have been publishing this one, were also putting out there on other systems. But regardless of whether there is limited specs on this or not, for so many people, if they had a Commodore 64, this is the version of Street Fighter 2 that they wanted, they looked forward to, and did the graphics really matter as long as it brought the gameplay from the arcade into the home? Well, yes. And no, though. Growing up in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the graphics of a system became increasingly more of the focal point of which games were compared across systems. But whilst the C64 version may not have had the prettiest graphics out there, I'm sure there were many players who were still very excited to experience Street Fighter 2 on their home computer. Now, previously on weird versions of Street Fighter games, perhaps I should say that in a different way. Weird versions of Street Fighter game. No, maybe not. Well, anyway, I previously checked out the Brazil-only Master System game that released 6 years after the arcade game, and also when the Master System had been replaced by both the Sega Mega Drive and the Sega Saturn, and was only 1 year from when the Dreamcast launched. Then, after that, I dove into the Amiga version, which had a bizarre control scheme, and whilst it looked great on paper, it had massively reduced animation. In my last video, I checked out what is the strongest candidate yet in the weird spectrum, and that was the ZX Spectrum version, which was entirely two-tone and had massive loading times on original hardware. Check out these videos in the series if you haven't seen them yet, as occasionally I'll refer back to them. Now, I didn't think any version of Street Fighter 2 could get any more reduced or weirder than the ZX Spectrum version, but then I played the Commodore 64 edition. If the ZX Spectrum game could be criticised for looking like someone got photos of the arcade game and scanned and photocopied the graphics onto coloured sheets of paper, the first thing that is bound to strike you about this C64 version is that it looks like you've opened a JPEG in Microsoft Paint in 1997 and reduced the image to be small enough to go on your GeoCities website. But, of course, there is more to a game than just graphics. But we'll get to the rest of that in a moment, as I'm not done talking about the graphics just yet. The good news is that in one sense, everything is represented in this version of the game. All of the characters are present, and you can recognise the locations and the character designs. None of the characters have faces at all in the gameplay, and weirdly in this version Ken has black hair, and Bison is wearing his grey suit rather than his red one. Look, It's probably just that Ken was palette swapped from Ryu in the truest sense imaginable, but if they could swap to make his gi red, then why not do a couple of extra pixels so that he's got yellow hair, or blonde hair I should say, but it was always yellow, you know what I mean. Looking at the stages, I think you'd only really know what each one is if you knew the original game as a point of reference. Looking at the Chun-Li stage as an example, I don't think most people would be able to tell that there are people sat around as onlookers to the fight. I'm sure most would think that a splash of green in the middle is just maybe a bush, and that maybe the yellow section with a bit of black at the top is a dog with a black head looking up at a window. If they could even guess that far. It's really not clear because they've just shrunk down and lost the resolution on all of the graphics. Now that said, the elephants on Dulcim stage are probably the best looking background objects in the game, and that is simply down to the size of an elephant. If an elephant wasn't that big, they would have likewise been reduced, but even with the downgrade in graphics, the elephants are large enough to still be clearly identifiable. The mural of the Hindu god Ganesh is kind of not so clear though in the same stage. Kind of looks like a stacked bowl of lettuce leaves for how recognisable it is. The game is super zoomed out and doesn't scroll left or right at all. You do get a tiny amount of vertical scrolling if you jump, but this is almost non-existent. On the channel, I've just looked at Virtua Fighter Mini for the Game Gear, and although that offers a zoomed in mode, the full stage zoomed out view on this Street Fighter 2 game reminded me of how the Virtua Fighter game looked. Whilst you may get away with this kind of zoomed out look on a 1990s tiny little handheld screen, this is a game that people would have played on their family TVs back in the day. Well, maybe. I would always have my games console plugged into my small TV and I'd be sat about a foot away from it like how people would sit with a laptop in front of them. Even to this day, I find the transition to play modern games on a big screen HD TV whilst sat on the sofa quite difficult. But enough about me and my need for glasses. The point is, this was a TV game, not a handheld game, and if you were sat across from this on your sofa, it would have looked pretty rough on a big screen. But whilst the graphics may not be all that, surely this was a needed reduction in order to maintain the gameplay from the arcade version, right? Well, of course not. The game kind of plays in the same realm as the Amiga and ZX Spectrum games that I've looked at previously. Now, with this one, after having read the comments on my previous videos, where it's been pointed out to me a few times that the Amiga game would allow you to use two fire buttons, one for punch and one for kick, but I played just with one, I was sure to check out if this could be played with one or two fire buttons. And lo and behold, it could be played with two. So I won't make the mistake of saying that this was a 1-button versus 6-button original arcade game. Now, this means it is similar to what I experienced with the Sega Master System version in that you have a punch and a kick button, but actually in reality it still kind of plays like the Amiga version. A combination of directional pushes and the fire button will determine what punch or kick you can pull off. This is fine, or it would be, but the rest of the game is still a bit of a mess. I experienced in this version that Vega would climb up his wall and then float in the air for ages, and at times my character would just be facing the wrong direction. Just like on the Spectrum version of the game, you can end up doing a weird flying punch, which looks just like this standard punch animation from when you're stood on the ground, but now it happens in mid-air. This means, in theory, that you are guaranteeing that the punch will be too high and will miss your opponent. But in reality, don't worry, as this is actually a really effective punch and will land on most occasions, even though it looks like it's above their heads. The game is kind of easy to pull off the special moves, which is good, because some of the versions, like in the PC or Amiga version, it was actually a little bit more difficult than in the arcade. I'll be honest, this was probably the easiest version of Street Fighter 2 I have played yet, and it was no trouble to beat. I could have won the whole game with just the punch button. And I literally mean just standing there and punching. But as I'm not the greatest Street Fighter player in the world, but not to say I'm bad, I think I'm pretty decent, I did try to play this game by pulling off a variety of the moves, just so that I could keep the footage interesting and that I wasn't just stood there punching in every single round. So this meant that I wasn't doing my usual spamming of fireballs and hurricane kicks, and I tried to hit a variety of punches and kicks, and occasionally it meant that my opponent would land a move. But that was very occasionally, and the game was still ridiculously easy. When you beat the game, the ending you will get will just be an image of your character's face from the character select screen. Considering in my playthrough I played as Ken, who was always shown with black hair in the actual game, you may be forgiven for thinking that this image is of Lisa, Ken's girlfriend, who has the first line of dialogue when the ending plays. Now, of course, everyone knows Ken, but literally it suddenly shows this blonde-haired person, and you're going to think it's Lisa, because throughout the whole game, Ken had got black hair. So, this game lacks proper endings, but at least they're still included in text form, as this betters what the Sega Master System and Spectrum did. This game also lacks the special stages where you destroy the car or break brick walls or barrels. This is also just the original Street Fighter 2, so you can't play as any of the boss characters which were introduced in the Street Fighter 2 Turbo and Champion editions. Music-wise, you had better hope that you like the character select screen music from the arcade version, as it was pretty much all I heard throughout the whole game until the end. Now, there may be one or two other tracks in the game, and maybe you get to hear something different if you play as a different character, or some of the characters have some music and some have others. I'm not entirely sure. I played this as Ken for my review here today. There's not much in way of other sound effects either, but what there is just about does enough to fit the action on screen. Little bleeps and bloops to be like the punches and fireballs, I guess. And look, this video series is me looking at all of the weird versions of Street Fighter that I can find out there. And I think there are still a few more weird and quirky versions before I may have to start renaming the series Street Fighter: The Good Ones, just to tell the most complete story. But after the ZX Spectrum game, this may be the most visually striking as different from the arcade original. It's just a shame that they didn't manage to replicate the gameplay of the arcade, as I think, especially many years after the release, players are now much more forgiving and appreciative of gameplay over graphics. So much of what I focus on this channel is retro or modern retro games, and so ultimately gameplay will win over visuals alone. But all this said, I'm sure there is a wash of nostalgia for some of you watching this who grew up with this version of the game and maybe loved playing it. I grew up mainly with the Amiga and later the Super Nintendo version of Street Fighter 2. So this has been a fascinating journey for me to discover and try to get my head into what would have been viewed and enjoyed by the C64 owners from 1992. If you're a big Street Fighter fan, I'm sure this would be fun for you to check out just for curiosity's sake. So whether you're new to the Commodore 64 Street Fighter 2 experience or not, this is definitely worth checking out. But heck, this series has focused just on ports of the original Street Fighter 2 so far, and any Street Fighter fan will know that the series didn't stop there with all of the supers and turbos and ultra versions of the various sequels that came later. But it's also true that the series didn't begin with Street Fighter 2. And as far as the Commodore 64 is concerned, there are still a couple more versions of Street Fighter games that are definitely worthy of this series. So let me know your thoughts about this game in the comments. I do try to reply to everyone who gives me some thoughts on the videos on the channel. Did you play this game back in the day, or do you think you'll be checking it out in the future? Also, what version of Street Fighter 2 should I look at next? There's a bunch for me to check out, And in this series, there is still lots for me to see before I am scraping the bottom of the barrel with the not so weird and excellent Super Nintendo Genesis and all of the other good versions of the game. So that is going to wrap things up for this video. If you haven't seen them already, there are 3 previous parts to this series where I check out the Master System, the ZX Spectrum and the Amiga versions of Street Fighter 2, and they are all weird in their quirky, unique ways. So also on the channel you'll find lots of documentaries, reviews. I do focus a lot on retro and modern retro stuff, but there's a bunch of hardware reviews on here as well. Do check out www.xstreamed.tv/gaming for the written article version of today's discussion. And with that, until next time, stay safe, always stay extremed, and ciao for now. Boom, and we're off the air. Once again, sonic boom, and we're off the air.